In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the rise of the Portuguese Seaborne Empire. The map on this slide gives you an indication of territory controlled at one point in time or another by Portugal. And this is a map, if you're looking to date this, would be in the 16th century. So parts of South America, some parts of Central Africa, a lot of coastal Africa, the coasts in the Indian subcontinent, and as far away as southern Japan. The Portuguese had a number of motivations for seeking to expand. Certainly land is always in high demand. There were an excess of soldiers in Portugal at the time due to political consolidation that had ended. So what better use for soldiers than to put them on ships and send them someplace else, because if you keep them around, they could turn on you. Some Portuguese citizens became interested in overseas territories for honorific titles and for glory. Others were interested in trade and profit. Many Portuguese had Christian missionary zeal. Others were curious and wanted to visit new places. In some ways, you could consider Portuguese expansion to be a continuation of the Crusades that we've talked about in previous weeks. Certainly, there's an element of many Portuguese believing that their version of Christianity was superior to others, and that Islamic peoples were somehow inferior. And so that was certainly a factor in traveling overseas. You might be surprised to hear the name Portugal when talking about the first truly global or world power, because it is a fairly small nation. Even at the time we were talking here in the 15th and 16th century, Portugal only had about 1.5 million people. The Reconquista, or the reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula, had taken place much earlier in Portugal than it did in Spain. Spain didn't really finish until 1492 when they conquered Granada in the southern portion of modern-day Spain. The Portuguese finished their Reconquista, or the reclaiming of these lands from Islamic rulers, in the 12th century. Portugal had a much stable monarchy, much more stable than other European nations at this time. If you think of Britain at the time, in the 15th century, they were fighting the War of the Roses. The French hadn't even unified what is modern-day France at this time. Places like Burgundy were still, relatively independent. The Portuguese had an ideal location on the Atlantic seaboard, which gave them several advantages. Certainly, that being close to the sea is where you want to be if you want to expand and create a seaborne empire. They also had a long tradition of maritime activities and tens of thousands of sailors and ships at ready disposal, so that benefited them. Finally, there's this issue of the fidalgos. So the word fidalgo is similar to the Spanish word hidalgo, means son of someone. And in particular, a fidalgo or a hidalgo in the Spanish tradition would be the son of a noble, the son of someone, maybe with a capital S, someone. So there was a generation of fidalgos who no longer had wars to fight. The Civil War was long over, and you have to do something with these individuals. They're trained for warfare. They are seeking glory and making a name for themselves. And there just wasn't much else to do in Portugal. If you were, for example, the Duke of a remote region where there's sheep herding or grain growing, it isn't particularly lucrative, nor is it particularly exciting. So some of these fidalgos, this generation of young nobles seeking adventure and glory, helped catapult Portugal to the top as a world power. One of the most important reasons, though, for the rise of the Portuguese as a world power was a man named Dom Henrique, or Prince Henry of the Royal House of Aviz, A-V-I-Z. He lived from 1394 to 1460. He was the third son of King John of Portugal, the founder of the Aviz dynasty, and he was related to King Edward III of England through his mother's side. In 1420, he was named the governor of the wealthy Order of Christ, the Portuguese successor to the Knights Templar. As the third son of the Portuguese king, though, chances are were pretty slim, even for those days, that he would live long enough to be king. So he was always going to be, a claimant to the throne, but sort of a distant claimant. So he kind of carved a new niche out for himself. As governor of the Order of Christ, he had a very healthy and steady income stream, which allowed him to sponsor many voyages of discovery. I should add, that Prince Henry the Navigator went on very few voyages himself, and one we'll talk about in particular, but mostly stayed in his court at Sarge, which is on the screen here. He attracted scientists, and sailors, and merchants to his court. Unlike, and your book may say this too, I don't recall exactly what it says, but many textbooks have this mistaken impression that at Sarge, Prince Henry set up a school for maritime studies or something. They come with these crazy terms. It really wasn't a school. He was just a medieval prince that people came to see, and they were after his money or his sponsorship for these voyages, which he did. But he was very integral, even though, again, he almost never left his court at Sarge. Here is Sarge, very southern tip, extreme southwestern tip of Portugal on the Atlantic Ocean. If you were looking out from the court of Prince Henry the Navigator, which you can't anymore because it's no longer there, there is a memorial there for it, but this is the view that Prince Henry ostensibly would have seen looking out from his court. And this is your intrepid instructor in the beach near Sarge, thinking that in August it would be great weather for swimming. In fact, the water was probably about 39 or 40 degrees. The North Atlantic current comes right down the coast of Portugal at that time of year, and it was very icy, so I was in long enough to get a photo. Prince Henry had a number of motivations. He was a deeply religious individual, and there's some question to how to rank these. I would probably say God and gold would be 1 and 2, depending on the day of the week. He certainly wanted to spread the Christian gospel, to take back lands that were in the hands of pagans or Muslims. But he, was a man of his times, and a man who sought profit where he could find it. So he had these dual competing first motivations. Certainly he was interested in glory. He was born into a royal house, and this is sort of expected to make a name for oneself. One of the main interests, though, for Prince Henry was to find a route to what he called the Indies, places where valuable spices were grown. Things like pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and mace could only be, at this time, purchased through a very fortuitous route. If you think back to our early discussions of the Silk Road, you get an idea of how far things have to travel across land to get to Europe. So he wanted to sort of bypass Venetian middlemen, merchants who did business with the Arabs, who did business with the Persians, who did business with people in India and the Indian Ocean basin, and bring those spices to Europe at a cheaper price, and thus keep the profits for himself. Finally, Prince Henry was interested in an individual that we refer to today as Prester John. Prester John was a mythical figure. He did not exist. There's a number of theories as to who might have inspired this legendary figure, but he was believed by the Portuguese and many Europeans at this time to live somewhere in the east. So they had a term they referred to as the Indies, which could have been the Arabian Peninsula, could have been the Horn of Africa, could have been India itself. Europeans at this time had a very fuzzy notion of what the world looked like. They did not believe it was flat, unlike the common misconception about Columbus, but they believed the Indian Ocean was a closed ocean, and the Portuguese were among the first to contest that. But Prester John was believed to be a very powerful Christian king somewhere in the east, and Europeans believed fervently that all they needed to do was hook up with Prester John, and they would have a valuable ally against the Muslim world. We should not overlook the role of technology in Portuguese expansion. The Portuguese proved themselves to be very innovative, both in their use of new technology, their invention of new technology in their overseas voyages. Pictured here is a monument in Lisbon. Actually, it's in Belém, just to the west of Lisbon. It's known as the Pedral dos Descobrimentos, or the Pillar of Discovery. And Henry the Navigator is first and foremost on the far right. You can see he's holding a ship, and a number of other famous explorers are in this sculpture, including Vasco da Gama, who we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. The Astrolabe was used for measuring angles between observers and the stars, the moon, or the sun. It has Greek and Arabic origins as a land-based navigational tool, but the Portuguese and the Spanish began using this at sea, which was an innovation. With an astrolabe, you can determine latitude, which allows you to sail out of sight from land. Portolani or Portolan charts are maps that show coastal features and ports. They provide the user a very realistic depiction of the shore, but they do not take into account the curvature of the earth. They are very unhelpful in crossing open ocean where you can't see the land. They're better used for smaller bodies of water like the Mediterranean, or any place that you could stay in reach of the coast. But the Portuguese were among the innovators who began using these Portolani. Roteiros, we would translate this in English as rudders. They're more like diaries, maybe like a diary plus a map. They were highly accurate and secret sailing instructions that describe harbors and routes to get to various places. They would provide information about landmarks and other navigational information and drawings of notable features. And the Portuguese did their very best for several centuries to keep these from falling into the hands of would-be competitors. The Portuguese did not invent the cannon, and this use of gunpowder-based firearms, as we know from earlier discussions, first occurred in China. But the Portuguese innovation was to stick cannon on ships and make them sort of floating fortresses. The Caravel, or Caravela, that the English called the Carrack, was a very innovative ship that the Portuguese developed. It was very agile and easier to navigate. It had a tonnage of between 50 and 160 tons. Usually it was a three-masted ship, and it mixed a variety of sails. So it had a square-mast sail, which is kind of a northern European tradition. You can see it in the center on the ship, which provided power. And then they mixed in these triangular-shaped or lateen sails, L-A-T-E-E-N. And they got this idea from the Arabs in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. So it was lateen sails allow you to tack or kind of take 90-degree angles back and forth so you can sail against the wind. The Caravel had a very shallow keel instead of a very deeper keel. So shallow-keeled ships can go up deeper rivers as opposed to more ocean-going vessels. This is a very fast and maneuverable ship, although somewhat limited in its cargo capacity. Very little in the way of cabin accommodations. People generally slept on deck. Interestingly, too, you can see the forecastle and aft castle. These are structures built on the ship, but through which armaments could be fired. But they were very powerful ships for the time period, very innovative, and one of the reasons the Portuguese took off as a major seaborne imperial power. A much larger ship they developed a little bit later into the 16th century was the Nau. So these would be over 1,000 tons. They were more like, if the Carrack or Caravel was the floating fortress, this would be like a floating warehouse with cannon. They were designed to carry large cargoes and to protect them as best as possible. They were able to hold sufficient stores for much longer voyages than the Caravelas, which had to pull into port, relatively frequently after a few weeks for fresh water and food. The Portuguese were innovative in developing systems of maritime insurance to protect against hazards when ships were sent out to sea. Of course, it's very expensive to outfit a ship and send it to sea. So this was just another modernization or innovation the Portuguese were forerunners of. The beginnings of the Portuguese Empire is the next section that we'll take a look at. So we have to see how Portugal goes from being a tiny nation of 1.5 million people at the beginning of the 15th century into becoming a world power. This process begins with the capture of a place called Ceuta on the North African coast in 1415. This was an expedition, and it's one of the few times Prince Henry actually left Portugal. He was on this initial military expedition against Ceuta. 45,000 soldiers and support personnel on 200 Portuguese ships left Lisbon in 1415. European observers kind of knew something was going on, but they didn't know exactly where the Portuguese were going. They did catch the defenders of Ceuta off guard, and it was a relatively quick victory. Unfortunately for the Portuguese, they had originally thought that if they captured Ceuta, they would have this, stranglehold on trans-Saharan trade, especially gold. But the caravans just found other ports to go to, and they sort of bypassed Ceuta since it was in Portuguese hands. And so it was a military victory and a capture of some land and territory, but it did not provide the Portuguese the wealth they thought. The next series of expeditions were down the West African coast, and Prince Henry was sponsoring these voyages again. He would send out ships, sometimes several per year. The expedition led by Gil Ains to Cape Bojador was particularly significant because Europeans believed this is a point of no return, where if you went too far, sea monsters would devour you. It's in the modern-day Western Sahara. In my crudely drawn map here, you can see one of the reasons why this had been a source of difficulty for Europeans is the way that the waves and current systems travel. At Cape Bojador, they split. They either go north or south. So the difficulty in the past, before the development of ships like the Caravela, was that ships would go past Cape Bojador and never come back. Now, they didn't get eaten by sea monsters, but they just couldn't make it back because of the winds and the currents at that point. Continuing down the African coast, 1441, you can see, if you look closely, Antão Gonçalves and Nuno Tristão. Nuno Tristão was a knight in the employ of Henry the Navigator. The success of this expedition led Portuguese merchants and adventurers to apply to Henry for slave trading licenses. Between 1444 and 1446-ish, several dozen Portuguese ships set out for slave raids around Arguin Bay, which you can see is near the center of this particular map. They started initially hunting seals, but they brought back slaves to Prince Henry because they couldn't catch seals on one expedition, and this proved to be a very lucrative trade. Lisbon almost overnight became a major slave selling market, and this really was the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. So if I sound enthusiastic about Prince Henry the Navigator, keep in mind he was also the world's first merchant in human trafficking in the transatlantic slave trade. So rather mixed history for our friend Prince Henry. Alves Caramosto was a Venetian ship captain, so he wasn't ethnically Portuguese, but was in the employ of Prince Henry the Navigator. 1455, he discovered, at least for Europeans, the Madeira and the Canary Islands. 1456, he discovered the Cape Verde Islands. He sailed about 60 miles up the Gambia River. Caramosto's accounts of journeys, especially the detailed observations of West Africa, are invaluable to modern-day historians. The Canary Islands eventually go to the Spanish, but both of those major island chains were major sources of sugar cultivation. And this was sort of a way in which the Spanish and the Portuguese learned how to make very healthy profits from exploiting human labor in the form of slaves to produce a particularly lucrative cash crop, which is sugar. There was an interesting, Prince Henry the Navigator died in 1456, by the way, and there was a little bit of a lull in a Portuguese expansion, in part due to attempted coup d'état on the crown, or civil discontent in the country. But there was an interesting discovery that was made by João Vaz Corte-Real, the explorer, and he called it Terra Nova do Bacalhau in 1472. Now, the Portuguese, remember, are very secretive about where they go. But he called it the new land of the codfish. Now, the Portuguese had been traveling into the North Atlantic to fish for cod, which are very big at this time. Some of them were up to about 8 feet in length, although the North Atlantic has been kind of overfished on cod. But they're a very important commodity for the Portuguese prior to traveling to India, was codfish, because you can dry it very easily. You can sell it. It keeps for a long time. All you got to do is reconstitute it with water. So João Vaz Corte-Real landed someplace in the North Atlantic that he called the new land of the codfish. This might have been Newfoundland. He might have beat Christopher Columbus to North America by 20 years. Now, of course, there have been other Europeans, not the least of which were the Vikings, who we know today wound up in Newfoundland, Labrador, and parts of Canada. But we're pretty sure he was somewhere in the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland and may have set foot on North America. The next major figure that leads Portuguese expansion, after this period of civil war and a little bit of discourse, is João II, who was the grand nephew of Henry the Navigator. As a prince, John II accompanied his father in campaigns in northern Africa as a young man. He was made a knight after victory in the conquest of Arzila, northern Africa, in 1471. 1473, he married Leonor of Vichy, the Infanta of Portugal, his first cousin. Hey, it was crazy times back then, and that kind of thing was pretty normal among the royal houses of Europe. The significance is he kind of kickstarts and jumpstarts Portuguese expansion again. He's very much interested in the unexplored lands and the potential for profits that exist overseas. And after Henry the Navigator, he is probably the second most important figure in leading Portugal's expansion. And he begins to sponsor new voyages. So Diogo Cao, the first European known to cross the equator. I'm sure there were plenty of others who did, and we just don't have records of. But in this image, you can see a padrao, or a pillar, a marker, erected by Cao at the river Congo. He was the first European known to sight and enter the Congo River, and he explored the territory of Central Africa from the equator all the way down to Walvis Bay in Namibia. He left the marker reads something like, here arrived the ships of King John II of Portugal, and the names of the explorers. João II also sent forth explorers to go to what is modern-day Ethiopia. Now, this is one of the places that Europeans thought Prester John might be located, because the Ethiopians, as we've talked about in previous weeks, were a Christian kingdom, but they weren't really well known, at least by first-hand experience, to the Europeans. And of course, it's very difficult to get to Ethiopia, at least except for the modern world where you can fly there. But it's in a highland region, so it's 10,000 to 15,000 feet in the air, and difficult to arrive at. But this is one of several efforts by the Portuguese to locate this legendary priest king, Prester John. The Cabo da Boa Esperança, which we would translate as the Cape of Good Hope, was passed by Bartolomeo Diaz in 1488. He made it around. And this is the point at which the Portuguese knew there was another route by which they could get to India. So by this time, the Portuguese had figured out that the Indian Ocean was not a closed ocean, and there was a route to get there. And the Portuguese are in a very enviable position. Unfortunately, at this time too, though, you have Christopher Columbus getting ready to make his voyage across the Atlantic. So the Portuguese go into kind of wait and see mode after a few years to figure out what has Columbus done and how does this affect us, because they knew at this point that they had a route they could get to India. The Indian Ocean Basin at this time is really the center of world commerce. And you can see just a few of the items that are being traded in this region, either with this region being sort of the center for goods going back and forth between Europe and East Asia, or many products themselves. So a great number of spices, textile products. Left off of this map here, interestingly, is the East African merchants. And I'm going to have to make a point to update this map as I'm looking at it, because slaves, ivory, and gold were traded from East Africa to some of these other regions. But the important point is that the Portuguese knew this was a place where there was a lot of valuable commodities, and they had to get there. The Spanish, too, knew of the existence of this region. I mean, they've been receiving these products through Venetian and Arabic traders for hundreds of years. So 1494, we have already had Columbus travel to the New World and back. The Portuguese at this time know that they have a route to the Indies. So they agree to develop a treaty with the Spanish. Now it has to involve the Pope, and it doesn't really go so well for the Portuguese because there's a Spanish Pope on this time, and so the Spanish kind of have one of their own on the throne, or the papal throne. The Treaty of Tordesillas, though, essentially divided the world into two spheres. This map shows you the boundaries of the Treaty of Tordesillas. You can see, though, interestingly, there's this dotted line. We'll get to that in a second. Everything to the west was supposed to be Spanish territory. Everything to the east was supposed to be Portuguese territory. Now, of course, the English, the French, the Germans, the Russians, anybody else who might have an interest in some of these areas, the Italians, they were not happy about this treaty, and of course, many of them denounced it. But again, you had a Spanish Pope on the throne, and the dotted line represents the original line of demarcation at the 38th longitude. And interestingly, the Portuguese insisted on getting this pushed further west. Now, to the Spanish, this seemed like a no-brainer. They're like, okay, you want some open ocean, you can have more open ocean, because as far as they knew, Columbus had landed in the West Indies, what we would today call the West Indies, and there was nothing else there between the 38th and 46th marker. So some conspiracy theorists, or even educated historians, suggest that maybe the Portuguese knew of the existence of Brazil, and that is why they insisted on moving this line further west. The other explanation, of course, is the Portuguese were just negotiating, and they had no clue as to the location of Brazil. But it wouldn't surprise me that the Portuguese, again, who were so very secretive and kept all their information tightly close to the vest, would have known about this. At any rate, after this treaty is signed, there's a new king, by the way. We've got Manuel I. Vasco da Gama, in his famous voyage, he is the first European to go around the coast of Africa, the southern coast of Africa, and get to India. The first voyage, 1497 to 99, a very significant expedition with 4 ships, 500 men. When he arrived in Calicut, his first words allegedly were, "We seek Christians and spices." So this reinforces this idea that they were still looking very dedicated fashion for Prester John. The second voyage, a much bigger fleet, 20 ships, over 2,000 men, and this was a voyage built heavily on the use of what we would today call gunboat diplomacy. So Vasco da Gama showed up in places like Calicut on the Indian coast, the Malabar coast of India, and places like Kilwa on the Swahili coast of East Africa, and essentially gave an ultimatum, either sign a trade treaty with us or we will bomb you into oblivion. Of course, they didn't quite have enough firepower to destroy entire cities, but it was fairly effective at getting some of these local leaders to come on board with the Portuguese. The Miri was a pilgrim ship. You can see it's spelled there, M-I-R-I, as a way to try to enforce Portuguese rule in this was actually in the Arabian Sea, which is kind of like the northern part of the Indian Ocean. This pilgrim ship was traveling back from Mecca and had mostly women, children, and old people on it. And in order to make his point, Vasco da Gama ordered the burning and sinking of the ship with all the occupants on it. So very harsh realities that the Portuguese were seeking to impose on the Indian Ocean basin. In terms of a legacy, Vasco da Gama made almost overnight Portugal a dominant world power. He provided a new route to the east. Something known as the Estado de India comes out of this, or it translates directly as State of India, but it's like the the Portuguese Seaborne Empire in India. This opened a new period of European expansion, and the Portuguese reputation became one of, I don't know how else to put it, they became known as rather ruthless thugs who would do whatever they needed to do in order to protect their new empire. Here's a quick image of the Estado de India, the method by which the Portuguese set up shop in the east was mostly to get these small regions, little port cities, hold on to those tenaciously and try to control all the choke points or the main trade points in these networks. And for the better part of 100 years, the Portuguese had an almost exclusive lock on spices and other Asian and South Asian products traveling to Europe, and they became extremely wealthy in a very short period of time. In terms of early effects, Portugal again became a major world power. This really changed the political and commercial structure of the Indian Ocean basin. The Portuguese established themselves as a dominant power, not the only power in the Indian Ocean basin, but again, throughout the 16th century, they were the most powerful maritime force in the Indian Ocean basin and had a stranglehold kind of on much of the trade coming out of there. This was a very significant blow for the Venetians, who again had that middle person or middleman trading with Arabs and Persians going through the Middle East. They used to control the spice trade and some of the important east-west trades, and they were almost overnight sort of booted out of these trades, and they never really recovered from it. Prior to the arrival of the Portuguese as a world power, the Venetians had been sort of on the rise. They were a major commercial power and something of a military power in the Mediterranean basin, and that loss, again, almost overnight of revenue doomed them. Portugal dominated the spice trade to Europe in much of the 16th century, became very wealthy. But good news, bad news for the Portuguese there, because other European powers became very interested in tapping into the profits that the Portuguese seemed to have monopolized. This brings to a close our brief look at the Portuguese Seaborne Empire.